Heartless cop blocks Black woman from visiting her dying father. Then the doctor calls her by rank. There is a particular kind of waiting that has nothing to do with patience. It is not the ordinary waiting of inconvenience, the mild friction of a delayed appointment or a slow line. It is the waiting that happens when you know something critical is occurring in a room you cannot reach, and the distance between you and that room is not a physical impossibility, but a decision someone else has made about whether you belong there. It is the waiting that has a weight to it, that presses against the chest from the inside, that does not respond to the ordinary tools people use to manage time. You cannot read a magazine through it. You cannot scroll a phone through it. You cannot think yourself into a more neutral relationship with the minutes. The minutes simply arrive one after another, and each one carries the same unanswered question, and the question does not reduce over time. It accumulates. Claudette Osei had spent her professional life in emergency medicine. She had trained for that field deliberately. She had chosen it because it was the discipline that most directly confronted the moments when time became a clinical variable rather than an ambient condition when the passage of minutes was not incidental but causally connected to outcomes. She understood the body under pressure. She understood what cardiac compromise looked like on a monitor, what the numbers meant, what the trajectory of a particular set of readings indicated about the next hour, the next 6 hours, the next morning. She had sat with thousands of patients in the acute phase of serious illness. She had held the hands of people in the worst moments of their lives. She had delivered information that no one wanted to receive. She had done all of this with the particular professional steadiness that emergency medicine requires and that she had worked for years to build. She had not expected to need any of that steadiness for herself. Not at 44. Not on a Tuesday night in November, sitting in a family waiting area at a hospital she did not work at 40 feet from her father's room, while a security officer who had stopped listening to her sat at his post and did not pick up his phone. Her father's name was Kofi Osei. He was 79 years old. He had come to the United States from Ghana in 1972, 22 years old, with a degree in engineering from the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, and the particular kind of conviction that brings a person across an ocean to a country that has not made any promises. He had settled first in New York, worked his way through graduate school at night while working days, and moved to Millbrook when Claudette was 3 years old, having accepted a faculty position in the engineering department at Millbrook State University. He had been at that university for 38 years. He had become a full professor at 51. He had taught structural mechanics to undergraduates and graduate students who were now, in some cases, themselves professors. He had raised Claudette and her younger brother Marcus in a house on Avery Lane that he had bought in 1986 and had not moved from since. The house had the particular character of a place that had been lived in with genuine attention for 40 years, a well-maintained garden, a workshop in the basement that smelled of wood shavings and machine oil, a kitchen table that had hosted 4 decades of dinners and arguments, and Sunday mornings with newspapers spread across its surface. He had been retired for 4 years. The retirement had suited him. He still went to campus occasionally, still answered emails from former students, still read widely in his field and in others. He cooked in the mornings and worked in his garden in the afternoons, and called Claudette on Sunday evenings, reliable as the week itself. They talked for 40 minutes or an hour. About her work, about his reading, about Marcus and Marcus's children, about things that had happened in the news, about small, specific things that mattered only between the two of them, the way small, specific things do in long relationships. The last Sunday call had been 4 days before the heart attack. He had sounded the same as always. There was nothing in his voice that told her anything was coming. The heart attack came on a Monday morning. He had been at home. He had felt the initial symptoms and had driven himself to Millbrook Regional Medical Center, a decision that troubled Claudette deeply when she heard about it, though she also recognized it as entirely consistent with who he was. He had walked into the emergency department, described his symptoms in precise and useful language, and had been triaged into the acute care pathway within 6 minutes. The workup confirmed a significant myocardial infarction. He was transferred to the cardiac ICU at 11:15 that morning. His condition was serious and was classified as critical. The attending physician assigned to his care was Dr. Amara Okonkwo. Claudette received the call from her brother Marcus at 1 in the afternoon. She was between patients. She was in a room with the door closed, and she heard what Marcus said, and she held the phone and went through the information methodically, asking the questions a physician asks when a family member gives an account of a medical event. What exactly were the symptoms, and in what order? What was the arrival time? What was the working diagnosis? What specific interventions had been performed? Who was the attending? She noted all of it. She kept her voice level. Marcus was not keeping his level, and she understood that, and she let him not keep it while she kept hers because that was the arrangement they had always had, and because someone in the conversation needed to be extracting the clinical information clearly. After she hung up, she sat for 60 seconds. Then she finished her shift. She did not do this because she was indifferent to what was happening with her father. She did it because she was a physician responsible for patients who needed her to be present, and leaving in the middle of a shift without appropriate transition would have been a choice she could not undo. She arranged coverage. She spoke to her department head. She drove home, changed, packed a bag with 3 days of clothes, and got in her car at 7:40 in the evening. The drive from her city to Millbrook was 3 hours and 12 minutes by the route she knew. She arrived at Millbrook Regional Medical Center at 10:53 in the evening. The hospital complex was familiar to her, in the general sense that hospitals have a shared grammar, a common language of signage and infrastructure that a physician reads without having to consciously decode. She found the cardiac ICU without difficulty. She found the visitor entrance. There was a security officer posted at the entrance desk, seated behind a counter with a panel of monitors and a computer terminal and a telephone handset resting in its cradle. He was a young man, perhaps 30, with the particular quality of someone who had recently established a professional identity and was not yet fully at ease in it. His name tag said Fitch. She did not know what would happen next. She would think about that later. She would think about the fact that she had walked through the entrance with a straightforward anticipation of what was about to occur. She would say who she was. She would ask for her father's room. She would be directed to it or escorted to it, and she would be at his bedside within minutes of arrival. She had been a physician for 19 years. She had presented herself at hundreds of hospital access points, had navigated the institutional architecture of a dozen hospital systems, had moved through the bureaucratic and procedural layers of medicine, with the accumulated competence of someone for whom these environments were native ground. She did not expect any difficulty. There was no particular reason to expect difficulty. She was a family member arriving to see a critically ill patient. She had identification. She had professional credentials. She had made the drive in 3 hours because her father was in the cardiac ICU after a serious heart attack. She had no reason to expect what happened instead. Damon Fitch had been working security for Millbrook Regional for 14 months. He had come to the job from a retail loss prevention position that he had held for 2 years before that, and before that, he had done a short stint in a shipping warehouse, and before that, he had completed a security training certificate at a community college and decided that the field suited him. He was 30 years old. He was not unintelligent. He was the kind of person who had arrived at a professional identity that he found clarifying, who had found in the structure of rules and protocols and post orders a framework that reduced the complexity of any given situation to a manageable set of decisions. The framework told him what to do. He did it. When a situation fit the framework, it was resolved. When a situation did not fit the framework still told him what to do, which was to hold the position until someone with more authority resolved the question. The after-hours ICU visitor protocol was in his post orders. He had read it. He knew its provisions. He knew that visiting hours ended at 8 p.m. and that exceptions were available through the charge nurse, and that the mechanism for requesting an exception was a phone call from the security desk. He also knew or had concluded that his role in the process was to direct visitors to the waiting area and to make the call when he was ready. His post orders did not specify a timeline. They said he would contact the charge nurse regarding exception requests. They did not say immediately. They did not say within 5 minutes. They said he would do it. He had not done it in 14 months of working this post, and this was not because he was lazy or indifferent in some general sense. He had done it before. He had made the calls. He had directed visitors to the waiting area and contacted the charge nurse within a reasonable interval, and the exceptions had been granted and the visitors had gone in. He had done this correctly before tonight. What was different tonight was something he would not have named or acknowledged explicitly, something that operated at the level of a decision that felt like a non-decision, like the simple application of procedure when it was in fact a choice about whose request was going to be treated as urgent. He would never have articulated it this way. He would have said, if asked, that he was following procedure, that the policy was the policy, that her badge was from a different hospital, that he could not verify her credentials. These things were technically true, and they were also not the full account of what happened, because the full account included the 29 minutes between the first request and Dr. Okonkwo's arrival, when he made no call when the phone was in its cradle and his hands were at his keyboard, and the decision to pick it up was available to him at every moment and was not made. She stepped up to the desk and told him who she was. She said her name. She said her father was Kofi Osei, that he was a patient in the cardiac ICU, that he had been admitted following a myocardial infarction that morning, and that she had driven from out of state to be here. She said she was a physician, an emergency medicine physician at a medical center in her city. She reached into her jacket pocket and placed her hospital ID on the desk in front of him. The badge had her photograph. It had her name. It had her title, Attending Physician Department of Emergency Medicine. It had the name and seal of her institution. It was a current valid institutional identification credential from a legitimate medical center. Officer Damon Fitch looked at the badge. He looked at it for a moment that was slightly too long to be a casual glance and too short to suggest he was genuinely reading it. He looked up at her. He said the ICU visiting hours had ended at 8 p.m. She said yes. She was aware of that. Her father was in critical condition. She had driven 3 hours. She was asking for an exception based on the clinical circumstances. He said the policy applied to everyone. She said she understood that. She said she was asking to speak to the charge nurse directly so that a formal exception could be authorized through the appropriate clinical channel. She said she knew that exceptions existed for this kind of situation and that she was asking to access the process for requesting one. Fitch said she would need to wait in the family waiting area while he contacted the charge nurse. He indicated the waiting area down the hall to the left. He said he would make contact when he had a moment. She picked up her ID badge from the desk. She said she was a physician at another institution, and that while she understood her credentials could not be verified in Millbrook Regional's system, she was still identifying herself and asking to speak to the clinical team regarding her father's care. Fitch said the badge was from a different hospital and that he could not verify her credentials. He said hospital policy required that he treat all visitors according to visitor protocol, regardless of what identification they presented from outside institutions. She looked at him. She held the badge. She said, "My father is in critical condition in a room that is 40 feet from where I am standing. I am an emergency physician. I have been driving for 3 hours. I am asking you to contact the charge nurse." Fitch said he would contact the charge nurse when he had an opportunity. He gestured again toward the waiting area. He said it would be more comfortable to wait there. Claudette Osei walked to the family waiting area and sat down. She was a tall woman, broad-shouldered and precise in her movements, with the particular physical economy of someone who had spent decades on their feet in high-acuity environments. She sat in one of the waiting room chairs, which were upholstered in a fabric the color of sand, with a firmness designed to be tolerable for short durations, rather than genuinely comfortable for any duration at all. There were fluorescent lights overhead. There were framed prints on the walls, photographs of outdoor scenes, a meadow, a river bend, a mountain with snow at the summit. There was a table with a stack of magazines from 2 months ago. There was a television mounted to the wall set to a cable news channel at low volume, the scroll of headlines moving across the bottom of the screen in continuous indifferent motion. She did not look at the television. She did not look at the magazines. She put her bag on the floor next to her chair, placed her hands flat on her thighs, and looked at the floor for a moment. And then she stopped, looking at the floor, and looked at the door to the ICU corridor instead. The door was visible from where she was sitting. It was a standard heavy-gauge hospital corridor door, white-painted steel with a small reinforced window at eye level. It was 40 feet away. She could see the light through the window. She knew the ICU was on the other side of that door, and she knew her father was somewhere in that corridor, and she sat and looked at the door and waited. She understood what his condition meant. That was the particular quality of those 31 minutes. She was not waiting in ignorance. She was not a family member without medical training sitting in a waiting room not knowing what the clinical picture meant. She was an emergency medicine physician with 19 years of experience in acute care, and she knew what a serious myocardial infarction in a 79-year-old man meant. She knew the range of trajectories. She knew the ways things could stabilize and the ways things could decline. She knew the specific language of cardiac monitoring, the numbers and their implications, the intervention thresholds. She carried all of this knowledge with her into the waiting room where it was not useful to her in any practical sense because she was not in the room. She could not read his monitor. She could not speak to his nurse. She could not ask the attending what the last set of troponins had shown, or what the echocardiogram had revealed about wall motion, or what the team's assessment was of his overnight trajectory. She was 40 feet away, and she had all the knowledge and none of the access, and she sat with that combination, and it had a weight that was unlike anything she had sat with before in 19 years of clinical medicine. She thought about calling Marcus. She decided against it for now. Marcus was already frightened. Calling him to report that she was sitting in a waiting area because a security officer was not making the phone call he said he would make was information that would increase Marcus's fear without changing his situation or hers. She would call him once she was in the room. She looked at the door. She looked at her watch. It was 11:07. 5 minutes passed. She went over it. The policy, the logic of it. The legitimate institutional reasons that after-hours ICU access controls existed. She was not opposed to the policy. She understood what uncontrolled after-hours ICU access would look like from a patient safety and clinical management standpoint. She had worked in an ICU. She knew what the overnight hours were like, what the staffing ratios were, what the demands on the nursing staff were at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. She knew that managing a stream of visitors when critical patients needed quiet and staff needed focused clinical attention was not a trivial problem, and she knew that a uniform policy with a formal exception process was a reasonable institutional response to that problem. She did not object to the policy. She objected to the fact that the person responsible for initiating the exception process had not done so. She had asked to speak to the charge nurse. That was the correct channel. That was precisely the mechanism the policy existed to include. And the person at the desk had said he would make contact when he had a moment and had not made contact. She had been waiting for 5 minutes. The charge nurse was presumably in the corridor behind the door 40 feet away. She looked at the door. She thought about her father. She thought about the Sunday evening calls, the particular rhythm of his voice when he was genuinely interested in something versus when he was being politely attentive the way he called her Claudette, when he was being serious, and Cece when he was not a nickname from her childhood that had never fully fallen away. She thought about the last Sunday call 4 days ago, about what he had said near the end of it, which was something about a book he was reading, a history of early 20th century West African architecture, and how he had found in it a reference to a building type that had appeared in a paper he had written 30 years ago, and how he was considering writing something, perhaps just a few pages, perhaps nothing publishable, just for himself, about what had been understood and what had been missed in the scholarship of that period. He had been engaged. His voice had carried the warmth of someone in the early stages of an intellectual project, the particular pleasure of a mind working on something it finds genuinely interesting. She thought about that voice. She looked at the door. She thought about the drive, the specific quality of a 3-hour drive made in a state of controlled urgency, the highway at night with its particular monotony, the mile markers passing with the regularity of a countdown. She had driven in silence for most of it. Not silence exactly. The road noise, the ventilation hum, but without music, without the radio, without anything that would interrupt the steady, low-level monitoring she was doing of her own internal state. She was checking herself the way she checked patients, assessing the level and nature of the distress, evaluating whether it was affecting her judgment or was being managed sufficiently to preserve function. She had found it manageable. She had been frightened in the specific way that you are frightened when someone you love is in a cardiac ICU and you are on a highway in the dark, and the distance between you is decreasing but not yet closed. She was frightened, and she was driving well, and the two conditions were not in conflict. She had done this before, not exactly this, but the thing of holding a clear, necessary task in her hands while the fear sat alongside it. She had been doing that for 19 years. She had thought on the highway about what she would find when she arrived. She had thought about it clinically, and she had thought about it as a daughter, and the two framings kept arriving together, rather than separately intertwined in the way that medicine becomes intertwined with the rest of life for people who have practiced it long enough. She knew what critical condition meant. She also knew that people came back from it. She had seen them come back from it. She had helped them come back from it. She held that knowledge alongside the fear, not to diminish the fear, but because both things were true, and she was a person who lived in the truth of what she knew, rather than in a simplified version of it that was easier to carry. She had not expected the waiting room. She had not expected to sit for any duration between the parking lot and her father's bedside. She had expected friction, perhaps the ordinary friction of a late arrival, the need to identify herself, the possible wait for someone to verify her connection to the patient. She had expected 2 minutes of that, perhaps 5. Not 31. Not a phone that was not picked up, and a door that did not open, and a badge held in her hand for half an hour while the fear sat in her chest, and the monitor on the other side of the white-painted steel door ran its trace for an audience she was not part of. 10 minutes. She had been in the waiting room for 10 minutes. There is a particular experience that medical professionals have that almost no one else has, and it is this, the experience of knowing exactly what is at stake clinically while being positioned as a family member rather than a clinician. It is not common. Most physicians have the luck, if that is the word for it, of being the professional in the room when the serious thing happens to someone they love. Claudette was not that. She was not Kofi Osei's physician. She was his daughter. She had no standing in his chart, no clinical authority in this institution, no basis on which to request information about his care beyond what any family member could request. She was his daughter, and she was also an emergency physician, and those two things were both entirely true and entirely unconnected in this context, and the disconnection had a specific quality that she had not fully understood before this moment. She had told patients' families over the years that she understood how difficult waiting was. She had said it with sincere compassion. She had not previously understood it from the inside in the way she understood it now. 15 minutes. She stood up. She walked back to the entrance desk. Fitch was at the desk. He was looking at his monitor. She said, "Have you contacted the charge nurse yet?" He said he had not had an opportunity yet. She said, "My father is in critical condition. Every minute is clinically significant. I'm asking you to make the call right now." Fitch said she needed to return to the waiting area. She said, "I will return to the waiting area as soon as you make the call. I am watching you make the call. I will wait here while you make it, and then I will return." Fitch's expression shifted slightly. It did not become hostile exactly. It became more fixed. He said hospital security protocol required that family members remain in the designated waiting areas during after-hours restricted access periods. He said he would contact the charge nurse when his current tasks were completed. He said if she remained at the desk in a way that impeded his duties, he would be required to address that. She stood at the desk for a moment. She looked at him. She was measuring something, not her anger, which was present, but controlled, but something more precise. The distance between what this moment was and what it should be, and whether anything she said was going to close that distance. She looked at his face, and she understood that the gap was not going to close through anything she said to him, and that understanding arrived with a cold clarity that was worse in some ways than the anger. She said, "I would like you to note that I have asked twice for you to contact the charge nurse and that it has now been 15 minutes and that my father is in critical condition." Fitch did not write anything down. He said he understood her concerns. He said the charge nurse would be contacted when possible. Claudette returned to the waiting area. She sat down. She put her hands on her thighs again and she looked at the door again. She thought 40 feet. The door is 40 feet from this chair. On the other side of that door is a corridor, and somewhere in that corridor is a room, and in that room is her father, who is 79 years old and who has had a significant myocardial infarction, and she has been sitting here for 15 minutes, and she has a medical degree, and 19 years of clinical experience and a hospital ID badge that she is holding in her hand, and she cannot get through the door. She looked at the badge. She had picked it up from the desk when she went back to the waiting area. She was holding it the way you hold something without realizing you're holding it some small object that is in your hand, because you carried it there, and because putting it down would feel like a concession of some kind. The badge had her photograph on it. She looked like herself in the photograph, which was not always the case with institutional ID photographs. She was wearing the same jacket she was wearing now, or one like it. In the photograph, she was looking at the camera with the direct, not quite smiling expression that institutional photographs tend to produce, the expression of someone who is being documented and knows it. She had shown this badge to a security officer at the entrance to the ICU, and he had told her it was from a different hospital and that he could not verify her credentials. She was still holding it. She had been holding it for 15 minutes. It had not opened a single door. 20 minutes. The television scrolled. The fluorescent lights did what fluorescent lights do, which is to illuminate everything evenly and harshly, removing shadow, removing the small visual mercies of less institutional lighting. The chairs held her. The prints on the wall were exactly as indifferent as they had been when she sat down. The meadow was still a meadow. The river bend was still a river bend. The mountain with snow at the summit had not changed its relationship to the summit. She thought about the patients she had made wait, not through negligence, not through indifference, but through the ordinary compression of emergency medicine, where the patients in the most acute need were addressed first, and the patients whose need was serious, but not immediately life-threatening, were asked to wait sometimes for long intervals in chairs similar to these ones with similar lighting, and she had gone to them eventually when it was their moment, and she had done her best work for them, and she had thought about those waiting intervals as a professional problem to be managed rather than as an experience to be inhabited. She inhabited the experience now. She understood it differently than she had understood it before. She thought, this is what it is. This is what it actually is. She did not think this with bitterness toward herself. She thought it with the directness of someone taking in new information and letting it be accurate. 25 minutes. She checked her phone. There was a message from Marcus sent 8 minutes ago. It said, "Where are you?" The message had the particular anxious brevity of a person who is frightened and is trying to ask a question without asking all the questions at once. She typed back, "I am at the hospital. I am working on getting in. I will call you when I am with him." She put the phone back in her pocket. She looked at the door. She thought about the things she could do. She had thought about these things in the first 10 minutes, and she thought about them again now. She could call the hospital's main line and ask to be connected to the cardiac ICU directly. She could call Marcus and have him call the ICU from his phone. She could ask for the patient advocate on call if a patient advocate service was available at this hour. She could ask Fitch for the name of his supervisor and contact that person. She could sit here and wait for him to eventually make the call he had said he would make, or wait for the charge nurse to come through the corridor door for some reason that would make her visible, or wait for some other resolution she had not yet thought of. She had been calculating these options and their likely outcomes for 25 minutes. She understood with the particular clarity of a medical professional analyzing a system she knew from both sides that every formal channel she accessed from this chair would produce delay. She could call the main line. The call would be routed and she would be put on hold and eventually connected to someone who would need to refer the question back to the charge nurse, who would need to communicate with the security desk, who was the same security desk that had not made the call. She could request the patient advocate. If one was available at 11 p.m., the response time would be measured in minutes or more likely 20 or 30 minutes, which would produce another waiting interval on top of the one she was already in. The most efficient path, the one with the smallest number of steps between her and her father's room, was the one Fitch had already told her about. He contacts the charge nurse. The charge nurse authorizes the exception. The door opens. That path had a single gate, and the gate was Fitch's decision to make the call. She had asked him twice. He had not made the call. She was sitting in a chair holding her ID badge 25 minutes after arriving at the entrance to the ICU, and 25 minutes after showing that badge to the person who held the gate, and the badge was still in her hand, and the door was still 40 feet away, and the gate was still closed. 28 minutes. The corridor door opened. A woman came through it. She was perhaps 38, wearing a white coat over scrubs, carrying a tablet computer, and moving with the purposeful, unhurried quality of someone who knows exactly where they are going and has been in this building long enough that navigating it requires no conscious attention. She came through the ICU corridor door and into the waiting area hallway, with the kind of stride that belongs to clinical spaces that is shaped by years of moving between rooms that matter in ways that require speed and composure in equal measure. She was a black woman, natural hair pulled back, dark eyes that were taking in the hallway and the waiting area with the automatic clinical scan of someone trained to assess rooms quickly. Her white coat had her name embroidered on the chest, Dr. A. Okonkwo, attending physician cardiology. She had come to check on the family situation. She had noted in the last hour that Kofi Osei had asked twice about his daughter the second time, with a clarity and focus that indicated he was aware enough of his surroundings to know she had not arrived yet, and aware enough of the drive she was making to understand that by this hour she should have arrived. She had also noted that the cardiac ICU had received no notification of a family visitor exception request from the security desk, which was the formal channel through which such requests were routed. She had been managing the specific concerns of the overnight period in the ICU, but she had held that absence in the background of her attention, because when a critically ill patient's family member is expected and has not appeared and no request has come through, there are a limited number of explanations. She had decided to come find out which explanation applied. She walked into the waiting area. She looked at the chairs. She saw Claudette. She looked at Claudette. She looked at the badge in Claudette's hand, visible, turned outward, the photograph, and the institutional seal facing the room. She looked at Claudette's face. She said, "Dr. Osei." She said it the way you say a name when you recognize someone, not a question, not a confirmation request, but an arrival. A statement that closes a gap. She said your father has been asking for you. She said those 6 words, and they arrived with the weight of everything that had accumulated in 31 minutes of waiting. They arrived with the weight of the clinical knowledge and the powerlessness and the badge in the hand and the door 40 feet away and the fluorescent lights and the indifferent mountain and all 28 minutes of sitting in that chair, knowing things that were not helping her get through the door. They arrived with that weight, and they also arrived with the specific information they contained, which was that her father was asking for her, which meant he was conscious and oriented enough to ask which was its own form of clinical data. The most important kind, the kind that was also just a father asking for his daughter. Claudette stood up. She stood up immediately in the particular way of a person who has been waiting to stand up and now has permission to do so. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. She simply was sitting, and then she was standing because sitting was no longer the condition that applied. Dr. Okonkwo turned to look at Officer Fitch. She looked at him with the particular expression of someone who has arrived at a scene and understood it immediately, who has assessed the situation with the specific competence of a professional who deals in quick, accurate assessments, and who has determined without ambiguity what has occurred here. She said, "I have authorized a family exception for Dr. Osei's daughter. Officer, please step aside." She said it the way clinical authority speaks, when it is not in doubt about itself, with the particular tone of someone who is not asking a question or negotiating a position but stating what is going to happen next. It was not aggressive. It was not loud. It was exact, and it was not a request. Fitch stepped aside. Dr. Okonkwo held the ICU corridor door. Claudette walked through it. She walked down the corridor with Dr. Okonkwo, who told her in the precise and efficient language of clinical communication that her father's condition had stabilized somewhat in the last 2 hours, that his rhythm was controlled, that his pressure was holding at acceptable levels, that the team was cautiously optimistic about the overnight trajectory, but that he remained in a critical classification and the next 12 hours would be important. She absorbed this information as she walked. She asked 2 questions, specific questions about the troponin trend and the echocardiographic findings. Dr. Okonkwo answered both. The walk from the waiting room to Kofi Osei's room took 90 seconds. She went in. He was in a bed near the window connected to a cardiac monitor that ran a continuous trace across a screen at the head of the bed connected to an IV line that disappeared under a dressing on his left forearm, with a blood pressure cuff on his right arm, and a pulse oximeter clip on his right index finger. The room had the particular quality of a critical care space at night, the low ambient light and the steady sounds of monitoring equipment, the specific combination of technology and stillness that belongs to rooms where the work is vigilance and the patients need quiet. He looked smaller than she expected. He looked older. He was 79 years old, and she had seen him 6 weeks ago at Thanksgiving. And he had seemed like himself, like the particular version of himself that had been her reference point for 44 years, upright and precise and fully present. In this bed, connected to this equipment, he looked like the thing he actually was, which was an elderly man who had had a serious heart attack and was in the critical care unit of a hospital. He was awake. He looked at the door when she came in and he saw her, and something in his face changed. It was not a large change. It was the particular change that happens when someone who has been waiting for a specific person sees that person arrive. A slight settling, a reduction of some tension that had been present. He said, "Cece." She said, "I am here." She pulled the chair to the side of his bed and sat down, and she took his hand and she sat with him. She did not say anything else for a moment. He did not say anything else either. They simply occupied the room together, which was what the moment called for after the drive and the waiting area, and the 31 minutes, and the badge and the door and all of it. They were in the room, and he was alive, and she was there. After a while, he said, "You had trouble getting in." She did not ask how he knew this. He had been asking for her for an hour, and she had not arrived. He was a man who understood institutional processes and could draw inferences. She said there was a delay at the desk. He said they kept you waiting. She said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How long?" She said 31 minutes. He did not say anything to that immediately. She felt his hand in hers, the particular texture of his hands, which were large and had the quality of hands that had done things, that had built things, and drawn things, and repaired things, and graded papers for 38 years. His index finger had a small scar on the outer edge from a workshop accident when she was 12, a table saw incident that had been much less serious than it initially appeared. She had been terrified that afternoon. He had been calm, methodical, assessed the wound himself, driven to urgent care. Come home 4 hours later with 5 stitches and his characteristic composure, and had a conversation with Claudette that evening about how wound assessment worked and how the most important thing in any acute situation was accurate evaluation before reaction. That was when she had started to think about medicine as a possible direction. He said 31 minutes. While I was in this room. She said yes. He said, "Did you tell them you were a doctor?" She said yes. I showed my badge. He said the badge was from a different hospital and he could not verify it. He was quiet again. Then he said, "You drove 3 hours." She said yes. He said, "And you sat for 31 minutes." She said yes. He breathed. He looked at the ceiling. He said that should not have happened. She said no, it should not have. He said, "I'm glad you were here." She said, "I am not going anywhere." The monitor traced its steady lines. Outside the window, which faced the parking structure on the east side of the campus, the night was dark and clear, the kind of November night that is cold enough to be definitive about what season it is. She could see a few lights in the parking structure and a piece of sky above the roofline. The sky was very dark, and there were no stars visible from this window, because the ambient light of the hospital complex was too bright against the glass. She sat with him until he slept. Then she sat with him while he slept. Dr. Okonkwo came in, once checked his readings, made a note on the tablet, looked at Claudette over the bed, and said, "He is stable." Claudette said, "I know." She said it the way 2 physicians speak to each other with the compressed economy of shared professional language. Dr. Okonkwo nodded and went out. She called Marcus from the hallway at 1 in the morning. She told him what she knew, the condition, the stabilization, the overnight trajectory, the cautious optimism. She told him the truth about the 31 minutes, because Marcus would need to know, and because she was not in the habit of managing information toward a more comfortable version when the accurate version was available. Marcus was quiet when she told him. Then he said some things that were not quite words, the kind of sounds people make when language is insufficient. She let him make them. Then he said, "What are you going to do?" She said, "I am going to stay. I will figure out the rest in the morning." She stayed. She was there when the morning shift came on, there when the first light came through the window above the parking structure. There when the day team began making rounds and Dr. Okonkwo appeared again. Now 20 hours into whatever stretch she was working, with the specific quality of presence that belongs to physicians in the deep of a long clinical period, the slightly stripped-down alertness. Dr. Okonkwo briefed Claudette on the overnight course the numbers had moved in the right direction. Not decisively, not conclusively, but the right direction. The next 24 hours would tell them more. Claudette said thank you. She meant it specifically, not generally. She meant it for the night before, for the waiting area, for the 6 words. Dr. Okonkwo said, "I am sorry you waited as long as you did." Claudette said, "You were not responsible for that." Dr. Okonkwo said the policy exists for a reason, and the exception exists for a reason. And the exception was not processed the way it should have been. Claudette said no, it was not. She did not file the formal complaint that morning. She was not in a condition, emotionally or logistically, to do that, while her father was in the cardiac ICU and she had not slept. She made a note in her phone, a specific and detailed note with the time of arrival, the time she had shown her badge, the exact language of the exchange with Fitch, the duration of the wait, the time Dr. Okonkwo had appeared, the exact words Dr. Okonkwo had said, and the time she had entered her father's room. She made the note with the precision of someone who understood documentation and who understood that the detail would matter later when the immediate moment had passed and the formal record needed to be accurate. She did not do this out of anger exactly. She did it out of the particular conviction of someone who knows the difference between what happened and what is recorded and believes strongly that those two things should correspond. She filed the complaint on day 2. She did it in writing, formally addressed to the hospital's chief of staff and patient advocacy office. She described the incident with precision. She named Fitch. She noted the policy, the exception mechanism, the specific request she had made, his specific responses, the duration of the wait, and the fact that she had been holding her professional identification badge in her hand for the entire 31 minutes. She noted that she understood the institutional logic of after-hours ICU access restrictions, that she was not objecting to the existence of the policy, and that her objection was specific. The exception process had existed and had not been followed, and the failure to follow it had kept a family member from a critically ill patient for 31 minutes during a period when the patient's condition could have deteriorated. She was specific in the complaint about the badge. She wrote, "I showed my hospital identification to the officer when I arrived. The badge identifies me as an attending physician in emergency medicine. The officer stated that he could not verify my credentials because the badge was from a different institution. He was correct that he could not verify my clinical credentials with Millbrook Regional's system, but the badge was not being offered as clinical credentials. It was being offered as identification. I was not asking to treat patients. I was asking to visit my father. I was asking the officer to initiate the family exception process through the charge nurse, which was the correct channel which I identified, and which the officer declined to use for 31 minutes. She was also specific about the badge in a second way. She wrote, "I held the badge in my hand for the entire duration of the wait. It did not help me. I want that documented. I want the record to show that an emergency medicine physician sat in a family waiting area for 31 minutes holding her identification while her father was critically ill 40 feet away, and that the mechanism for getting through the door was not her identification or her credentials, but a phone call that was not made, and that the phone call was eventually rendered unnecessary because a colleague came through the door and spoke her name." The chief of staff read the complaint. She convened a review meeting within 48 hours. She reviewed the security footage from the ICU entrance. The footage confirmed the timeline. Claudette had arrived at the desk at 10:53 p.m., had shown the badge, had spoken with Fitch for approximately 4 minutes, had been directed to the waiting area, had returned to the desk at 11:07, had a second brief exchange with Fitch, and had returned to the waiting area. Fitch had not made a call to the charge nurse between 10:53 and 11:25, which was the time Dr. Okonkwo entered the waiting area. The charge nurse on duty that night, when contacted, confirmed that she had received no call from the security desk regarding a family visitor exception request during that period. She also confirmed that the exception policy was well established, that she made exception authorizations regularly during the night shift, and that a phone call from the security desk would have taken approximately 2 minutes to result in an authorization. 2 minutes. The gap between 31 minutes and 2 minutes was 29 minutes of a decision not made. The security contractor was notified. Fitch received a formal written reprimand. The reprimand cited failure to follow the exception notification protocol and failure to exercise appropriate judgment in a time-sensitive family access situation. It noted that his stated rationale that he could not verify the visitor's credentials from a different institution reflected a misunderstanding of the purpose of the exception protocol, which existed precisely for situations where standard visitor verification procedures were insufficient, and which required only a phone call to the charge nurse to initiate not credential verification from the security desk. The reprimand became part of his personnel file with the contractor. The chief of staff issued a revised ICU after-hours visitor policy. The revision had several components, but the central addition was what the policy memo called the physician-family exception, a specific provision acknowledging that family members who are themselves medical professionals may identify themselves as such, and that security personnel are required to immediately initiate the charge nurse notification when such an identification is made, regardless of institutional affiliation of the identifying credential. The revision also added a general provision strengthening the existing exception language, clarifying that critical condition. Classification of a patient was itself grounds for expedited exception notification and setting a maximum response initiation time of 5 minutes from the moment a family member requested an exception. The policy revision was not framed as a response to Claudette's complaint in its public language. The hospital's internal communications described it as a general improvement to the after-hours visitor protocol following a review. But the review had been prompted by the complaint, and the staff who worked the ICU desk understood that connection without needing it spelled out. The 5-minute maximum was specific. 31 minutes had produced a 5-minute standard. That arithmetic was readable. The hospital's patient advocacy office sent Claudette a formal written apology. It was a letter, not a form, not a templated document with blanks filled in, but a letter that addressed the specific incident, acknowledged the failure of the exception process, expressed regret for the delay she had experienced while her father was in critical condition, and committed to the policy changes described in the Chief of Staff's memo. The letter was signed by the Director of Patient Advocacy and by the Chief of Staff. It was mailed to her home address and also emailed to the address she had provided in the complaint. She received it on day 4. She read it in her father's room. He was awake when she read it. She did not read it aloud to him, but he could see from her face that she was reading something significant, and when she finished, he said, "Good news," or complicated news. She said complicated, but the right kind of complicated. He said, "Tell me." She told him. She told him about the reprimand, about the policy revision, about the 5-minute standard, about the formal apology. She told him in the methodical, complete way she did most things without editorializing, presenting the information as information. He listened. He was sitting up slightly, which was itself a change from the first 2 days. The team had adjusted his positioning as his condition improved. He had more color. He was more fully present in the room in the way that people who are stabilizing from a serious illness gradually become more fully present as the body reclaims the ordinary operations that the acute event had interrupted. He said, "And the security officer," she said, "formal reprimand." He said, "Is that enough?" She thought about it. She said, "I think it is proportionate for what it is. A reprimand and a policy change. The policy change will reach further than the reprimand. The next person who drives 3 hours to see their critically ill parent will have a different experience at that desk." He said, "If the policy is followed." She said, "Yes, if the policy is followed." He was quiet. Then he said, "You filed the complaint and you stayed." She said, "Yes." He said, 4 days. She said, "I am not leaving until you are out of this unit." He said, "That could be some time." She said, "I have arrangements." He looked at her. He had the particular quality in that look of a parent who has watched a child become an adult and is seeing both things at once, the person who is here and the person they started as. He said, "You know that 31 minutes was not only about your father." She said, "I know." He said, "And you filed the complaint knowing that." She said, "I filed it because of what it was. The 31 minutes were about me, and it was also about everyone who sits in that waiting room without a medical degree, and without the knowledge of what is happening in the room 40 feet away, and without the language to ask for what they need in a way that gets through. The policy change is not only for physicians' family members, it is for everyone who arrives at that desk with a critically ill parent and gets told to wait." He said, "Yes." She said, "It should not have required a formal complaint. It should not have required a physician to recognize me in a waiting room and say my name. None of it should have required any of what it required." He said, "No, it should not have." She said, "But it did. And now there is a record, and there is a policy, and there is a 5-minute standard. And that is what can be done from where I am standing." He said, "I raised you to do what can be done from where you are standing." She said, "You did." He was quiet for a moment. The monitor kept its trace. Outside the window, the November light was flat and white, the kind of autumn light that has no warmth in it but is clear and precise, revealing things as they are, rather than as they might appear under better conditions. He said, "I want you to tell me what it was like in the waiting room. The 31 minutes. She said, "You want the full version." He said, "I want the full version." She told him. She told him in the way she told things when she was not managing the information for a particular effect, not compressing it toward the minimum necessary to communicate the essential facts, but telling it the way it had actually been with the knowledge she had been carrying and the specific quality of sitting with that knowledge in a chair 40 feet from his room and being unable to use any of it. She told him about the badge in her hand. She told him about going back to the desk at 15 minutes and the exact words of that exchange. She told him about the calculation of the available channels and why each of them led back to delay. She told him about the television with the headline "Scroll" and the framed photographs of the meadow and the mountain. She told him about the moment Dr. Okonkwo came through the door. He listened. He did not say anything while she was telling it. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. Then he said, "Dr. Okonkwo." She said yes. He said, "She said your father has been asking for you." She said yes. He said when she said that. She stopped. She said yes. He said those 6 words. She said yes. He said, "I was asking for you. I did not know you were outside the door. I thought the drive was taking longer than expected. I thought perhaps there was traffic or weather. I was asking the nurses. They told me you had not come in yet. I did not know you were 40 feet away in a chair." She said, "I know." He said, 40 feet. She said, "Yes." He said, and she came through the door. She said she came through the door. He said, and she said your name. She said, Dr. Osei. She recognized the badge. He said, and you stood up. She said immediately. He looked at his hand. He looked at the place on his hand where she had held it the first night, the specific patch of skin on the back of his hand, thin and spotted with age, the particular skin of a 79-year-old man's hand. He said, "I am glad she came through that door." She said, "I am glad she came through that door." He said, "And I am glad you drove 3 hours." She said, "I will always drive 3 hours." He said, "I know you will." The days passed the way hospital days pass, in the rhythm of the monitoring and the rounds and the meals and the specific quality of light through the window at different hours. Claudette established the pattern of presence that she would maintain for 4 days. She was there in the mornings when the team rounded. She was there in the afternoons when the sedation wore off enough for him to be genuinely alert and interested in conversation. She was there in the evenings when the hospital became quieter and the overhead lights were dimmed in the corridors and the night shift took over with its particular attentiveness. She was not there every hour. She slept in the family accommodation room. The hospital provided a small room with a narrow bed and a window that faced an air shaft, which she used for 4 or 5 hours each night, setting an alarm and returning to his room when she woke. She called Marcus twice each day. She spoke to Dr. Okonkwo each morning and each evening. She built the relationship with the cardiac ICU team that a family member builds over 4 days of sustained presence, not intrusive, not demanding, but steady and available and clearly medically literate in a way that the team came to rely on and appreciate. She was careful not to position herself as a colleague in their institution. She was there as family. She held that distinction clearly and consistently. But she was also who she was, and the team knew who she was, and the conversations they had about her father's care were conversations between professionals who shared a clinical language, and that made the conversations more efficient and more substantive, and that served him. She thought about what it meant that Dr. Okonkwo had come through the door. She thought about the specific chain of events that had produced that moment. Kofi Osei had asked for his daughter twice in the last hour. Dr. Okonkwo had noticed the absence of a visitor exception request from the security desk. She had held that absence in the background of her attention through the specific demands of an overnight in the cardiac ICU, which were real and were numerous and which would have given a different physician sufficient justification to defer the question until morning. Dr. Okonkwo had not deferred it. She had come through the door. She had walked down the hallway and into the waiting area and seen the woman in the chair with the badge in her hand and said the name. That was the chain, a father asking for his daughter, an attending who held the absence in her attention and acted on it. 6 words. Claudette thought about what would have happened if Dr. Okonkwo had not come through the door. She did not think about it with anguish. Her father had stabilized. The outcome had been what it was. The hypothetical was not a wound she needed to press on. She thought about it as an analytic question. If Dr. Okonkwo had been in a procedure, if she had been managing a more acute patient, if she had been on the phone with a consultant or reviewing overnight labs or doing any one of the dozen things that an ICU attending is doing at 11:20 on a Tuesday night. If any of those things had occupied her attention at the moment, she would otherwise have noticed the absence. The waiting room chair would have held Claudette for longer. The phone would have remained in its cradle. The door would have remained 40 feet away. She would eventually have reached someone through the formal channels eventually, the word doing its quiet work. On day 3, his rhythm converted cleanly from the slight irregularity that had persisted in the first 48 hours to a steady normal sinus. The team considered this a significant marker. Dr. Okonkwo came to his room and told him this directly with the kind of clinical directness that patients appreciate when they are well enough to appreciate it. He asked the right questions. His engineering mind, Claudette noted, had always been interested in understanding systems and how things worked, and why they were in the state they were in, and he applied that interest now to the systems that were keeping him alive, asking about the mechanism of the arrhythmia and why the conversion had happened when it did, what the relationship was between the medication adjustment and the timing of the rhythm, change what the expected trajectory of those parameters was over the next 48 hours. Dr. Okonkwo answered each question with the complete engagement of a physician who respects the intelligence of the person she is treating. Claudette watched this exchange from the chair by the window. She thought about what she was watching, which was her father being himself in a hospital bed, applying the specific quality of his mind to the situation he was in. And she thought about how that quality had not diminished, which was its own clinical data point of the most important kind. On day 4, she called her department and confirmed her return date. She had been in contact with her department head throughout brief check-ins, and coverage had been arranged without disruption. She had not been absent from her professional life in the way that absence from professional life usually feels, because her professional knowledge had been present with her the whole time. A constant companion in the room, part of every conversation with the medical team, part of the way she read the monitor readings over her father's shoulder each morning, part of the specific way she understood each piece of information the team provided. You do not leave your medicine at home. It comes with you. In this context, it had been sometimes a comfort, and sometimes a weight, and most often simply what it was, the knowledge she had part of who she was available whether or not a door was open. On day 5, Dr. Okonkwo told them in the morning rounds that she was recommending transfer to the step-down unit. The cardiac ICU team had reviewed his overnight data, and the clinical picture supported transition to a lower acuity setting. He would remain in the step-down unit for additional monitoring and medication calibration, and the discharge planning would begin once he was settled there. This was good news. Not conclusive news, not the end of anything, but the beginning of the next phase of his recovery, which was the phase that could eventually include the house on Avery Lane and the garden and the workshop in the basement and the Sunday evening calls. He was moved at 11 in the morning. Claudette walked with him as far as the step-down unit entrance where the transfer team took over. She watched them take him through the door. The step-down unit had its own visiting policy more permissive than the ICU, with extended daytime hours and a simpler exception process. She went in an hour later when he was settled. He was sitting up in the new bed, which was slightly wider and slightly more comfortable than the ICU bed, without the full array of monitoring equipment that had surrounded him for 4 days. He looked at the room with the interested, assessing look of someone arriving at a new location and taking its measure. He said, "It is quieter here." She said, "Yes." He said, "I can see a tree from this window." She looked. There was a tree bare of leaves in November, its branch structure visible against the sky, the fine outer branches making a dense tracery against the flat white light. He said, "I have been looking at the parking structure for 4 days. I appreciate the tree." She sat in the chair by the window. She said, "I'm going to stay until tomorrow morning, and then I need to drive back." He said, "I know. Go do your work. Marcus is coming Thursday." She said, "I know. I have spoken to Marcus. He said he will fuss over me." She said, "He is allowed to fuss." He said, "You did not fuss." She said, "I was here. That is different from fussing." He said, "Yes, that is different." She stayed through the afternoon and the evening. She had dinner with him, hospital trays, which were not remarkable, but which she ate in the chair by the window while he ate in the bed. And they talked about things that were not his condition, which was a deliberate and shared decision to talk about other things, to give the hour a different quality than the preceding 96 hours had had. He told her more about the architecture book. He had been thinking about it in the intervals of the last 5 days, with the portion of his mind that was not occupied with the physical experience of being a patient. He described the gap he had found, the thing the scholarship had missed, with the precision and animation of a person returning to a subject that genuinely interests them, and Claudette listened the way she had always listened to him, with full attention, and the particular pleasure of watching someone's mind work well on something it cares about. She thought, "This is him. This specific quality of engagement and precision, this is not diminished." She left the next morning. She drove back in 3 hours and 12 minutes, the same route, the same 3 hours. She arrived at her own home in the early afternoon, unpacked her bag, and called Marcus. She told him everything was in order. She told him to call her from the room on Thursday. She said he will want to talk about the architecture book. Let him. Do not let him think you are not interested. He can tell when people are not interested. Marcus said, "I am interested." She said, "I know you are. I am telling you to show it." Marcus said, "Understood." She sat in her kitchen after the call. She sat for a while, not doing anything in particular, just being in her own kitchen, which was quiet and familiar, and hers with the particular quality of a room that has been lived in rather than occupied. Then she got up and made coffee and sat with the coffee and looked out the window, and she was present and accounted for and returned to her own life, and her father was in a step-down unit with a tree visible from his window, and the 31 minutes were behind her, documented and formally addressed and changed. Not erased, not erasable, but changed into something that had a record and a standard and a policy and an apology attached to it, which was not everything, but was what the available channels could produce. And she had used those channels with precision, and she had stayed at her father's bedside for 4 days, and she was home. She thought about Dr. Okonkwo coming through the door. She thought about that particular moment, the door opening, the white coat, the name embroidered on the chest, the direct eyes scanning the hallway, the moment of recognition. The 6 words, "Dr. Osei, your father has been asking for you." She had stood up immediately. She had been at his bedside in 90 seconds. She thought about the badge. She had worn it again the next morning in the ICU because it was the ID she had, and it identified her and the ICU staff who saw it on the 2nd day, and the 3rd and the 4th did not look at it the way Fitch had looked at it, as an insufficient document from an institution they could not verify. They looked at it and they saw it and they moved past it because identification was not the issue on those mornings. She had been the daughter of the patient in room 7. She had been Dr. Osei. She had been both of those things fully and simultaneously for 4 days. The badge had been in her hand for 31 minutes before that. 31 minutes of being fully who she was. Physician, daughter, woman who had driven 3 hours person, who understood the clinical situation with precision, and the badge had not opened the door. What opened the door was a colleague who recognized her name and had the standing to say, "Step aside." She thought about that. She thought about the people who sat in waiting rooms without the colleague, without the badge, without the clinical language, without the name that a physician would recognize. She thought about them sitting in chairs with framed photographs of mountains on the walls with headline scrolls running on televisions at low volume, with the particular weight of not knowing what was happening in the room 40 feet away, without the equipment she had to understand what the not knowing meant, or the professional identity that had nearly not quite not without 31 minutes of cost gotten her through the door. She had sat in one of those chairs. She knew something now that she had not known before. She was going to do something with the knowing. She did not yet have the precise form of what that was. She would find it. She drank her coffee. Outside her window, the November afternoon was giving way to early darkness, the light going out of the sky in the way it does in November, quickly, without ceremony. She watched it go. She thought about her father's voice, the Sunday call voice, the architecture book voice, the voice that would be there next Sunday, and the Sunday after that restored to the telephone and to the house on Avery Lane and to the workshop in the basement available again, not permanently. Nothing was permanent but available, and that availability was what the last 5 days had been for, and it was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was enough to sit with in a kitchen in the November darkness while the coffee went warm and then cool in the cup. She would call him on Sunday. He would answer. He would say her name, one version of it or the other, depending on what kind of Sunday it was. She would say his name back. They would talk for 40 minutes or an hour. About the architecture book, probably. About what he was reading, what he was thinking, the small specific things that accumulate in a long relationship and become a language of their own. She would listen to all of it. She would be fully there, fully available across the telephone and across the 3 hours of distance, present in the way that presence is possible when the alternative has recently been too clear and too close to allow any ordinary Sunday evening to feel ordinary again. It would feel like what it was. A father and his daughter on the phone on a Sunday. Ordinary and irreplaceable. 40 feet, 90 seconds, 31 minutes. The numbers did not reduce. They would not reduce. They were part of the record now, part of what had happened and what had been documented and what had been changed and what had been learned, and they were part of her. The way things that happen to you become part of you. Not as wounds, not primarily, but as knowledge, as the specific understanding that comes from having been inside a situation that you previously knew from the outside only. She knew something now. She was going to keep knowing it. Outside the window, the sky was fully dark. She got up and turned on the kitchen light. She put her coffee cup in the sink. She went to prepare for the morning, for the work that would resume for the patients who would need her to be exactly what she was. Precise, present, trained in the discipline of acute care, fully there when the door was open and the moment was hers to fill. She was all of those things. She had always been all of those things. Nothing about the last 5 days had changed that. Some of it had added to it in the way that certain experiences add to a person, rather than subtracting even the experiences that are painful, especially those. She turned off the kitchen light. She walked down the hall. The house was quiet and hers and known. Subscribe our channel if these are the stories you come here to find. We will keep telling them. Some stories are not about exceptional cruelty. They are about ordinary failures, the small decisions not made, the calls not placed, the 31 minutes that accumulate into something a policy revision cannot fully undo, but a formal record can name.